Hello, and thank you very much for coming along again this evening. This evening we're going to look at a very interesting interaction between the museum world and the real world. Now, the museum world is part of the real world, and in fact, everything in the real world these days is part of a record that is made, in some cases, explicitly for museums. So the interaction is not all that strange. But there's a very new way in which both the real world and the museums are interacting now because of the emergence of new kinds of technologies that allow you to go from one space to another space, and in fact invite you to go from one space to another space, and learn a lot in the process. So we're actually going to look at a whole interaction between gallery and reality, and we're calling it, for that reason, From Gallery to Reality and Back. The display of art and the art of display in the digital age. There are two aspects of it, obviously. One is the display of art and any other artifacts, books, maps, any kinds of things that we usually view in museums. It can be objects, can be pictures, can be any kind of representational art. But we're all talking also as well about the art of display. How are these things put on display in the digital age before a public that doesn't know much about them and wants to learn more? Well, one of the reasons why they want to learn more, and the museums are trying to get them to learn more, is that there's a growing gap between the people who go to museums and appreciate them and the younger generation. There is a falling off of attendance among the younger generation, and there are a lot of museums who are trying to adjust this at this point, including the Ontario Gallery of Art. Take a look at what Stefan Jost, its director, has had to say.
This is where all hours would...
Well,
actually,
all hours is all museum.
All
Right?
this beautiful stuff on the wall.
Absolutely.
Art Gallery of Ontario CEO Stefan Jost remembers the moment when he decided they needed to change. It was a Wednesday night when anyone can enter for free.
It's packed. I walk down the line. I say, hey, why are you here? And they look at me like I'm idiots because they're like, it's free. Okay, so right there you know that our price point is prohibitive for a certain segment of the community.
What are you hoping to see? What do you
Jost
want?
says although 20 to 30-year-olds are the biggest part of the AGO's demographic, admission prices were keeping more young people than new immigrants away.
Okay, that's our future. So it's actually not a great risk to bet on your future. Actually, the bigger risk is not betting on them.
Jost says if the new approach fails, it could cost the AGO $4 million in lost revenue. So this is a pilot project designed to run for a year and supported by $1.8 million from donors. The goal? A new generation of gallery goers.
We're pretty sure if you come in your early 20s, you'll come in your early 50s, and you'll come in your early 80s.
This is really a great photo.
Gail Lord works with museums around the world.
I think it's terrific that they're doing it. I don't think it's a big risk. However, we have a tendency in Canada, when we try things, we do it for a year. You don't change human behavior in 1 year. It is so well.
Lord says lowering admission prices makes sense because it's only 10% of revenue. She points to Washington and London, where the entrance to national museums is free.
In the UK, it resulted in 30 to 50% increase in attendance, and they have broken the social class barrier with free.
But admission is only part of the puzzle. This is one of the ways the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts is attracting new audiences, by attracting Kim Kardashian for a retrospective of fashion designer Thierry Mugler. In recent years, the MMFA has seen attendance triple to 1.3 million, attracting visitors with everything from fashion exhibits to art therapy. If you're 20 or younger, it's free. And for the under 30 crowd, there's the avant-garde VIP pass with special events.
They feel that it's their place, that it's the place to be, but also that it's their place. They don't feel that it's not their place, that this is my grandma museum. No, it's their museum.
From Vancouver to Toronto, events are popping up as museums look for ways to stay relevant. But it all starts with what you pay. And at this AGO lineup, the new prices are an easy sell. Did you hear that they're changing the prices, that now if you're 25 or under, you can go for free?
No, I didn't.
Yeah.
Cool.
It allows like younger youths to come at like no price and check out art, and I think that's great.
AGO's experiment begins later this month. Eli Glasper, CBC News, Toronto.
Okay, well there it is. It's an experiment so far, but they're going to try it later this month to make art exhibits free, certainly for youth. Meanwhile, in Boston's Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, there's another kind of technique that's being used. The museum's curators have developed innovative presentation material to enrich the viewer's experience and the experience of some of the most compelling pieces of art from all over the world. They've had a long tradition of very good European art, but they hold special shows of visiting art pieces. And their curators have developed very innovative online material that people can view ahead of time before going to the museum, or review after they've been at the museum. And while they're at the museum, there are some very clever and well-designed introductions to the art sequence that they're about to see. They sit you down in a room and give you an orientation. It's much better for viewers to be able to get that kind of contextualization of the individual pieces of art and see how they fit into the whole work of a particular artist and of his times. It's a staggering new development and means that there's as much going on, in a sense, in hyperspace, in the online development of the museum's presentations, as in the actual hanging of the objects in the museum. Another approach has been developed at Harvard, and it's really quite innovative as well in its own way. Harvard's Houghton Library, which is the rare books library at Harvard, has juxtaposed historical and modern objects for public view and study, juxtaposed them on the occasion, in this instance, of the 50th anniversary of the moonwalk. By juxtapose, I mean they take some objects from the period and other objects from different periods, but all having to do with space exploration or the imagination of space exploration well before it took place. That's where the rare book part comes in. And John Overholt has been the curator of early modern books and manuscripts at the Houghton for a while, so he knows what's richly present in their collections. He was recently interviewed by Jared Bowen here on WGBH in Boston. Take a look. In Open Studio, Jared Bowen produced this.
First up, in 1969, NASA made history when it sent the first manned crew to the moon as part of the Apollo 11 lunar mission. 50 years later, artifacts from that expedition are on view in an exhibition titled Small Steps, Giant Leaps at Harvard University's Houghton Library. It has cataloged mankind's lunar longings dating back to the Renaissance.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first man ever to set foot on the moon.
There seems to be no difficulty in moving around it as we suspected. It's even perhaps easier than the simulations of 160 that we performed in various simulations on the ground.
If you think about what Apollo 11 achieved, that it lifted human beings off the surface of Earth and got them safely to the moon, hundreds of thousands of miles away, that's an amazing achievement.
John Overholt is the curator of this exhibition celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 lunar mission, appropriately titled Small Steps, Giant Leaps.
I think people are hungry for an idea of an achievement that is greater than any one individual, something that's meaningful as a society.
Yeah, ring you back clear. How's it going? Roger, the EVA is progressing beautifully. I believe they're setting up the flag now.
The records, memorabilia, and even tools of that achievement are all on view here. In an age when space technology was in its infancy, the astronauts mapped the stars by literally holding up this chart on the moon.
Unlike any star chart before, it needs to show the position of the Earth because for the first time people were using it not standing on the Earth.
The moon we see here is a pretty dusty place.
There's a Velcro patch on the back that still has a little bit of moon dust trapped in it from when it was used on the lunar surface.
But curiosity surrounding the moon has existed as long as humans have longed to fly. And here at the Houghton Library, Overholt has chronicled mankind's lunar fascinations as far back as the 13th century.
We couldn't have hoped to reach the moon without Copernicus showing us how the solar system works, or Newton explaining the laws of gravity and planetary orbits, or Galileo's observations of the lunar surface through a telescope for the first time.
Alongside the scientific, the fantastical. Fictional works from the greats like Jules Verne, author of From the Earth to the Moon, and Cyrano de Bergerac, who imagined a lunar society that sees Earth as its moon.
The moon has historically been a really inspiring sight to spark the imagination, and many writers have set alternative worlds on the moon as a way of commenting on earthly society.
That curiosity would lay the groundwork for man's first attempts to leave Earth. From the Wright brothers to rocketry, the exhibition highlights a history of flight through original and one-of-a-kind scientific artifacts.
We see a couple of pages from the flight plan that the astronauts consulted every step of the way through the mission. This checklist that has a handwritten note, go to descent. That's the moment they were ready to land on the moon.
Roger, you're a go. You go to continue power descent. You're a go to continue power descent.
I think most remarkably of all is this little sketch that Neil Armstrong made for his father to explain the mechanics of the propulsion system on the Eagle lunar module. That's an amazingly intimate connection to the history of this mission.
In my head, I think about them sitting in the kitchen, perhaps at home in Ohio, and his dad's like, how does that work again? And him just like whipping out a piece of paper.
Anne-Marie Eze is the director of programming at the Houghton Library. For her, it's the little details that make this history come alive. Like this transcript of communications between mission control and the astronauts as they landed on the moon for the first time.
Tranquil days here. The Eagle has landed.
At the very bottom of it, Buzz Aldrin wrote afterwards, well, I spoke the first words spoken on the moon because, Neil Armstrong's the one who goes down in history for first setting foot on the moon, and he's like, hey, what about me?
Of course, Armstrong was the one to make headlines, especially in Ohio, in his hometown newspaper.
And it just says Neil steps on the moon. Of course, everyone knew who Neil was. And it has a photograph of his parents who are looking very happy and extremely relieved as well.
It's an intimate look at the pioneers throughout history who helped put mankind among the stars.
Well, we'd say nowadays humankind among the stars, but humankind has been among the stars, whether we knew it or not. What's fascinating about John Overholt's curation of this is that he's one of the few people around who knows enough to be able to curate all of those historically important documents from the Renaissance onwards. And Anne-Marie Eze has a very interesting take on the kind of casual aspects of this that are so important to have preserved all along the way. It's a fascinating exhibit. You should go see it. It's going to be on juxtaposing historical and modern objects for public view and study. It's fantastic. Yet another approach to the presentation of art and history has been pioneered by another Harvard professor, actually, Harvard Professor Vincent Brown. He's a specialist on Jamaica and has done a very interesting, close study, and he calls it a cartographic narrative. Now, a cartographic narrative is quite an innovation in itself. It's a narrative of maps, and particular map that he looks at in detail that gives information about the 1760-61 slave revolt in Jamaica. His work on this was really quite inspiring and led, among other things, for people to start to think how to use maps in public displays. There's an animated thematic map that narrates the spatial history of the greatest slave insurrection in the 18th century British Empire. It sort of goes day by day, week by week, month by month during that revolt, and it's a very clever historical analysis. So clever that, in fact, it's gone on to inspire greater things at Harvard. Professor Brown's been put in charge of, he's the director now, of a whole group called the History Design Studio. And it's experimented, this group has, with innovative approaches to present both art and history in the last several years. In fact, the public's understanding of history in the digital age has been significantly advanced with Harvard's History Design Studio, not only with Vincent Brown, but with his two very capable assistants and graduate students in their own right, Amy Alamu and Robin McDowell. They have just, in fact, put on a 2019 group exhibit, which the two of them curated with great skill, called Footprints Across Time. Professor Henry Louis Gates came to the opening of it and was very proud to be seen with and hear about the work done by Vincent Brown and these curatorial assistants. It was quite an event at the time. One of the exhibits, and it was only one of 10, there are 10 different components to this group exhibit, but one of them had to do with maps, stones, and plants, and the analysis of their role as agents of empire and the ecology of the Atlantic trade. Each item in this particular exhibit, part of the larger group exhibit, had a label with one or more QR codes on it. This, in a sense, was the innovation of this particular exhibit, because QR codes are the kinds of things that can take you beyond the gallery space into other space very quickly. You don't need to teach high school students how to use a cell phone. They know how to use cell phones, and they know what QR codes are. And they're always capturing them wherever they go, and they might as well start capturing them in museum space. So in this particular exhibit, viewers were invited to capture the QR code on their iPhones and then connect through the internet, Harvard's internet, to either historical or contemporary material related to the object in the exhibit. In this sense, the exhibit itself transcended the room in which it was housed. It moved into other space. Viewers were imaginatively transported from the gallery space itself to realities outside the gallery, directly related to the history and ecology of the slave trade and its aftermath throughout West Africa. You can take a look at some of the documents, and they're actually pretty interesting to zoom in on. In fact, you have to zoom in on them to understand them. This is why it was necessary to develop these QR codes in order to give people the chance to look at expanded versions of these original documents. Here you can see, for example, ships off the coast of West Africa near Mina, which is a town. El Mina is a town in the current state of Ghana, was known then as the Gold Coast. And the annotation in this illustration from the travelogue that this is an indication of fishing canoes off Mina, 500 or 600 of them at a time. Well, you can bet they're fishing for more than just their own consumption. 600 canoes out there fishing, getting a lot of fish. Well, as it turns out, in reference to the slave trade, as we know here in Boston, salted cod is one of the staples of international travel, naval travel. And this was a whole industry providing protein to the transatlantic trade. It's the kind of thing you can only get by expanding the original document and looking at it in detail. Same document has on the lower half of it a very interesting representation of another thing going on at the coast. And if you read the the annotation under it, under Part B, it's Negroes' canoes carrying slaves on board of ships at Manfro. Well, Manfro is this castle over to the right, and they're being brought out from the castle to be loaded onto the European ships. They're being paddled out. Here's the indication of the slaves. B. There's the slaves. These are the free men doing the paddling. Very interesting division of labor here, and only visible if you blow these up. And this is why the QR codes were provided for viewers to be able to do this. You can look in even greater detail on the blown up versions available through the internet connection of the QR code and see what's going on in terms of conversations, or at least the representations of conversations and reflection of slaves about to be put on the ships. Fascinating. Has a lot more to do with European imagery of what was going on than it does with maybe what was going on. In fact, there's no representation of shackles here, for example. This is not a photograph. It's a piece of art. It's a representation, a representation, and needs to be understood as that. But you got the idea. If you looked at the labels in any one of the exhibit items, it had within it this kind of square code, and the QR codes empowered the viewers to get outside the gallery context and view the original documents and their historical context. By their historical context, I also mean that it enabled people to look at the geographical context. If you scan in this kind of QR code, you can be taken into space and view that slave castle from above. The hyperlinks were also provided for people to look at things in detail. Now, history in the digital age has always involved new technologies, new data, new insights, and of course, new questions that come out of all of that. But with the exhibit techniques combined with these new sources of data and new kinds of questions, you have a very innovative way of engaging audiences in museums in ways that they've never been asked to participate in previous instances. For example, the display techniques in this exhibit provided a new way to look at old maps, wherever viewers encounter them. These obviously are maps of West Africa, maps from the early 1800s. They're laid on top of what? Well, you can see it. It's a view of Google Earth. So you can zoom into these maps and zoom into Google Earth underneath it, peel off the map, and see where it was relating to specific spots which are now viewable from space. But you're not limited to doing this in Africa, obviously. This is the case of the material provided in this exhibit, but the same kind of linkage between the object, its representation, a QR code to the original, and all of the context you wanted to build behind that original is available for any part of the world. You could take it up in West Africa as this exhibit did, but you could do it for the Mediterranean or for New York or Boston Harbor or anything you wanted to relate your museum exhibit to. It's the technology that's interesting here and the innovation of using QR codes as the means of transcending the gallery space to some kind of reality. So, from gallery to reality and back. How can this code help us experience Botticelli more completely? Well, scan it in and find out. Or how can the lower code help us view the wider world and the history of the slave trade? Well, this is why the display of art and the art of display in the digital age has really changed the nature of our encounter, both within museums and the importance of museums for our understanding the wider world. The work of history in the digital age, in this sense, has contributed a great deal to a new kind of citizen science alliance that's emerging around the world.